Jamie Brownlee will follow, speaking on the corporate corporation of academic research.
I want to start by just thanking Carlo and Brian for another great conference. They seem to be getting better and better every year. And I'm very proud to be speaking alongside so many people at this conference whose work I admire, including right here on my own panel. Well, my PhD dissertation, which actually just completed and defended a couple of months ago at Carleton, it focused specifically on the corporatization of Canadian universities. It was a very broad national study of the topic, and because of its breadth, it took kind of a ridiculous amount of time to complete. Maybe I'm just a slacker. I like to think it was the breadth of the subject matter. But I did complete it, and as luck would have it, my defense, took place in the Central Administration Building right next to President Roseanne Runte's office. I thought that was fitting, if only because President Runte is mentioned a few times in my dissertation, in part for her role in trying to create the Entrepreneurial University, but also for her role in repeatedly stonewalling, delaying my access to information requests on contract faculty hiring at Carleton. She did this on the grounds that processing these requests would, quote, unreasonably interfere with the operation of the institution. I was never quite sure why providing me with data on contract faculty would unreasonably interfere with the operation of Carleton, but that was her claim several times. Well, anyway, I won't be talking about President Runte today, although it was certainly tempting, or about academic labor. The next panel is going to address academic labor in some detail, and it looks very fascinating. What I want to do is talk about another aspect of corporatization. It's probably the aspect that, I'd say, shocked or maybe disturbed me the most as I was going through my research on corporatization in Canada. I mean, it's all ugly and awful, right? But this one really sent chills down my spine. And that is the growing preponderance of conflicts of interest and research bias in the academy, something that Jim touched upon in his opening speech. So that's what I want to talk about in the short time that I have here today. I guess I would start by saying that there is certainly no shortage of university scholars today who, by virtue of their corporate and other connections, are affected by conflicts of interest. One obvious example, I think, are senior academic economists in the US, but elsewhere too, some of them here, who hold lucrative and high-ranking positions in major financial institutions. I think one could reasonably say that the economics profession has become so compromised by conflicts of interest that it now functions almost as a support network, a support group for financial services and other industries. That may be overstating it, but I think that's reasonable. I think that's also one reason why the build-up to the 2008 financial crisis ran straight through the economics discipline. So that's one area, it's one discipline where conflicts of interest are rampant, and there are many others that one could talk about. What I want to talk about today is just one area, and that is biomedical research and academic medicine. Just to try to illustrate how serious I think things have become in this regard. I would say that corporatization has corrupted, perverted, possibly even destroyed academic medicine in some areas at least. There is by now a mountain of evidence that's been accumulated over the years showing that conflicts of interest systematically produce research bias in the academy. And this is especially true in places like, areas like biomedical research. You might say, well, that's obvious. Well, it's not obvious to most academics who consider themselves to be independent, objective, impartial, neutral, unbiased, pretty much across the board. In a small minority of cases, research bias results from deliberate academic fraud or corruption. And I don't want to minimize this. Outright academic fraud has certainly increased under corporatization. So just keeping to biomedicine, a recent review of retracted biomedical and life sciences articles found that the percentage of scientific articles retracted just due to fraud has increased more than tenfold since 1975. In fact, just a couple of years ago, some of you might have heard about this, a team of 100 scientists tried to replicate the results of 53 of the most widely cited cancer research papers. Their effort resulted in only 6 of the 53 studies being validated, while the rest could apparently not be replicated. It turns out that many, maybe most, of the studies were essentially bogus, fraudulent. And shockingly, these bogus papers were not, this was not pharma-generated junk science. This was mainly university researchers who were deliberately misleading companies who wanted to use their research for new cancer drugs. So clearly there's little honor among thieves. That being said, deliberate fraud does remain the exception rather than the rule. A much more common cause of research bias is the unconscious effect of things like financial benefit, career advancement, that sort of thing. And the logic here is very simple. Researchers with a vested interest in reaching a particular conclusion will tend to weigh arguments and evidence in a biased fashion. And again, the evidence for this is just overwhelming. And a lot of this relates very directly to funding source, right? Who's funding the research and the academics in question? Well, in terms of industry influence, examples abound. One study found that 94% of articles that had authors who were affiliated with the tobacco industry concluded that secondhand smoke was not harmful. 94%. In contrast, only 13% of articles where the authors had no tobacco ties reached the same conclusion. Another study found that sponsorship almost invariably, almost always, predicts the results in food and nutrition research. Or take, drug research. Researchers have found that academic studies of cancer drugs, for example, funded by drug companies are 8 times less likely to reach unfavorable conclusions compared with similar studies by nonprofits. Medical researchers right here in Toronto, they found that 96% of authors, again, almost all of them, whose findings supported the safety of a particular class of drug had a financial relationship with the drug manufacturers. This is compared with about 35% of authors who were critical of the drug's safety. And on, right? What's really important, I think, to recognize is that these kind of results are not unusual. I mean, they sound ridiculous, but they're not unusual. In fact, they're the norm. I mean, this is systematic. How do we know this? Well, if you look at meta-analyses of the biomedical literature, this is when researchers look at all the studies produced over decades, decades, about the relationship between, say, funding source and research outcomes. In other words, research on the research conducted over 20, 30, 40 years. When you look at these analyses, what you find is unbelievably strong correlations between industry funding and research bias in the academy. And when you consider that industry now funds roughly 70% of all clinical trials for drugs and other medical treatments that are conducted in academic medical centers right across the country, this is concerning, right, to say the least. Of course, it's not just research funding that facilitates research bias in academic medicine and biomedical research. According to one study I saw, 94% of psychiatrists in training have accepted gifts from big pharma by their 3rd year. And there's a very rich literature on how even the smallest gift can influence in a big way. Big pharma now spends billions each year developing what are called continuing medical education programs. Not education in any meaningful sense, they're more like pushing drugs. And in fact, medical researchers are the target of some of the most sophisticated marketing machinery on the planet at the moment. In the US, a recent survey found that 2/3 of department heads at medical schools and teaching hospitals had financial or other ties to industry. Pfizer alone had roughly 150 members of Harvard's medical school on its payroll. Apparently, the largest sums of money paid to these Harvard researchers involved trials of antipsychotic drugs on children. Evidence of the self-harm in these suicides that were thought to result from these trials were carefully buried along with the children. Currently, children as young as 1 year of age are being prescribed antipsychotics, with some clinicians even contemplating making in utero diagnoses. All in all, estimates are that between 1/3 and 1/2 of university scientists conducting drug research now have some kind of financial stake in the outcomes of their own research. And the same is true of many other medical researchers as well. It's just insanity. Well, of course, I have to mention one final source of research bias in academic medicine, elsewhere too, but especially here. And that is that corporate representatives are now just writing a lot of the so-called academic research themselves. I assume that most people here have heard about the phenomenon of ghostwriting. Well, if not, it's basically when academic papers are written, in whole or in part, by corporate representatives, and in the worst cases, academics are paid to basically just sign their names to the papers. Sometimes, maybe they participate a little bit in the research, maybe they have access to some of the data, maybe not. The compensation rates for professors who participate in ghostwriting can be as high as $10,000 for a single article, and professional ghostwriters are often paid between $10,000 and $20,000 a year, salaries that exceed $100,000, $200,000. How prevalent is ghostwriting in the medical literature? Estimates vary, but according to one study I saw by psychiatrist David Healy, the majority of articles on lucrative pharmaceutical drugs in the top medical journals in the world are likely to be wholly or partially ghostwritten. Healy even suggests that in some areas, such as the safety and effectiveness of antidepressants for children, maybe repeat that, the safety and effectiveness of antidepressants for children, virtually 100% of the published literature includes material that is ghostwritten by Big Pharma and their medical writers. As Healy writes in his new book, Pharmageddon, these studies of antidepressants in children offer the greatest known divide in medicine between what published reports in the scientific literature say and what the raw data in fact show. What they say is that antidepressants are remarkably effective and safe. What the data show is that children are killing themselves at about triple the normal rate when they're on some of these drugs. And of course, it gets even worse than this. Ghostwriting is only one part now of an increasingly sophisticated system of ghost management in biomedical research. Ghost management is basically the broader process of publication planning, where drug companies and their agents are involved. They direct and shape the entire research process. It's not just writing, right? From funding to research design, to publication, to promotion, to circulation. Today, over 50 different agencies openly advertise publication planning services. Many of them are subsidiaries of big PR and advertising companies. And the industry is now large enough that there's actually 2 international associations of publication planners who they organize meetings, seminars, and so on. According to Sergio Sismondo of Queens, who's done some of the best work on this, up to 40% of major journal reports on clinical drug trials are ghostwritten right through to publication. And for the most part, medical journals and their editors, they shouldn't be seen as dupes in this process. Right? Many of them are well aware of what's going on, well aware of the process, and they have extensive dealings with publication planners. Needless to say, ghostwriting, ghost management, and publication planning greatly amplify research bias, in addition to everything else I've already talked about, because commercial interests are involved at virtually every single stage of the academic research process. And it would be a great mistake, I think, to view these practices merely as a breakdown of editorial oversight, academic standards. On the contrary, this is a very well-organized and sophisticated industry that forms a integral part of the corporate production of knowledge. So just to conclude, do you have any time left? Go ahead. 30 seconds? Okay. To conclude in 1 minute, I chose to focus on this issue today, again, partly because it disturbed me personally, but also because I think it's a very glaring reminder of the dramatic social and human toll that the corporatization of the university can inflict. It's a reminder of why we can't let down in fighting against the corporatization of higher education. And the impact in this case really can't be overestimated. in my opinion. For universities, for medical schools, and the medical profession, it has severely degraded the basic values that have historically defined scientific research. It's produced an unprecedented crisis of credibility in the peer-reviewed literature. And I personally think it's permanently tarnished the academy as a source of disinterested inquiry, and one might say rightly so. Being here in Toronto, I would also be remiss not to point out that can result in very severe personal consequences for researchers who dare to challenge this corporate academic complex. Jim mentioned Nancy Oliveri, that's one famous case. There are many others. Of course, for the public, the consequences have been the most profound of all. These trends and practices are quite literally threatening the health and the well-being, in many cases the lives, of millions of people around the world, including children, who are the most vulnerable and helpless victims in all of this. And that's obviously of no small concern to any of us. With pharmaceuticals and medicine accounting for the largest number of industry-sponsored research contracts currently in Canadian universities, I think these issues could not be more pressing. Thanks a lot.